So today we're going to talk about comfort, suffering, and growth. This grew out of a conversation Matt and I had about, which was driven by a discussion online related to what does it actually mean to be pro-human? Because there are different philosophies behind what it means to be pro-human. Does that mean pro-human life, that we should save every life, or that we should have as many human lives as possible? And we didn't think that that was quite the right path. And what we landed on was the idea of building human meaning, or to put it really simply, that we're advancing the human story, right? And the more complex the story is, kind of the better off we are. There's more connectivity, there's more meaningfulness, which is a really, seems like a silly word, but there's a lot in that word that helps us to orient what we do to help build a better future for humanity. So we'll talk a little bit about that and kind of figure out, how do we grow? How does comfort prohibit our growth? And then how does suffering help us grow? And so to kind of give meaning to suffering or to hardship. So there's a quote I found, it's from Larry Elder. He's a conservative radio talk show host, and don't agree with a lot of things that he said, but this quote I thought was really good. Doing what you want to do is easy. Doing what you have to do is hard. And that, I think, is a good summary of what it means to grow and how we grow. If we're doing things that are easy, we're not growing. We're doing the same thing we've always done. Nothing new is happening in our brain, particularly. But doing what needs to be done for our growth, for ourselves, for our community, for humanity is hard, because it takes getting out of our comfort zone, pushing ourselves a little bit harder, doing something that maybe we could get away with not doing for ourselves, but we know is good for the greater community. So like I said, this came out of a discussion of what does humanism mean? So it's continuing and expanding meaning by building on that network of knowledge and connectivity as human culture has progressed throughout history. And so, again, simplifying, it's advancing the human story. If I had to say it in a simple sentence, that's what I would say. And that goes back to our core vision that humanity survives and thrives. So we survive for now, we put in the work so we can survive today, which today is pretty easy, right? We can live pretty comfortable lives without too much actual work. But to thrive in the future may require that discomfort that puts us in a better position in the long term. So why is this important? So from Alice in Wonderland, there is a concept, and it's sort of a philosophical argument about the Red Queen race. And the Red Queen, or Alice brings up that where I'm from, if you run and you work really hard, you get somewhere. And the Red Queen says, well, that's a silly place. Here, you have to run just to stay where you are, and you have to run as fast as you can just to stay where you are, and you have to run twice as fast to get anywhere. And that seems kind of like a crazy statement, but when you think about it in terms of evolution, right, you're always doing something to provide for yourself, right? Especially before we had such a luxurious society as we have today. So it used to be you literally ran everywhere to try and just survive. And then to make it ahead, you had to stumble upon something or work so much harder to create an efficiency that made it so you didn't have to run as hard just to stay where you are. And today, we have to do very little to stay where we are. Sustainment is very simple, very easy, particularly in Western society. It's not true everywhere. But on the whole, we could provide for all of humanity today. But that wouldn't necessarily advance us into the future. And so this concept of the Red Queen race, I think, is important to keep in mind as we think about the future, because if we want to get to a new goal, a new destination, we have to do more than just run as fast as we can today. We have to really push ourselves to run even faster to get to that new point. So, as I mentioned, from the evolutionary sense, we have dealt with suffering, we've dealt with hardship, but our bodies and most organisms are programmed to be lazy. And not lazy as in they do nothing, but to be as efficient as possible with whatever systems they're running, right? So humans are really good at storing energy, and we like sweet things because that's how we learn to survive. Of course, in today's environment, that's not necessarily an adaptation, that's a maladaptation because we live in a world of plenty. And so evolution will generally prioritize laziness, efficiency, and conservation, and that's all rear brain functions, right? Those are things that are programmed into our biology. But what we've built is something that has evolved beyond the rear brain. We have the front brain, the conceptual human versus the animal human. And so for us to progress as humanity, for us to advance the human story, our front brain has to win out over our rear brain. And what that means is running twice as fast, right? So that means a little bit of discomfort, a little bit of suffering to deprive ourselves of as much sugar as we would like to eat, or deprive ourselves of lazing about and watching movies all day. Because that's what's required to actually advance the human part of the brain, build meaning, contribute to something, invest in the community, make the world better. So I think that's an interesting point to remember because as we talked about in our talking goals, you have to hack your environment to make yourself do the hard things, right? And it goes back to understanding the evolutionary sense and realize that you're constantly fighting against your rear brain to achieve your front brain objectives. And that's hard because, that's got hundreds of thousands of years or even millennia, if you talk about the animal piece of who we are, programmed into us, and only maybe 100 or a couple 100,000 years of front brain activity to try and overcome that. So we have to be really smart about it and really deliberate to make it happen. And so I wanted to talk about just a little bit about comfort, suffering, and enjoyment, because we don't contrast suffering with enjoyment. You can actually enjoy suffering. Think about working out, right? So a lot of people don't enjoy the beginning part of the workout, but when they're done with the workout, they feel better about it, right? So their rear brain, their physical part of their humanity, suffers, right? It's hard, it hurts, doesn't feel good. But the front part of the brain benefits, the endorphins, the feeling afterward, the sense of accomplishment. So suffering does not necessarily mean that we cannot enjoy our existence, right? Suffering is not the point. And so I want to talk about enjoyment a little bit because I think it helps to conceptualize how it is that we can live our lives balancing comfort and suffering while still enjoying the whole thing. So at level 1 of enjoyment, and this is sort of just a theory that I kind of propose, at level 1 of enjoyment, you have the physical pleasures, right? Eating, drinking, being warm when it's cold, physical connection, sex to a certain extent, all fit in that basic category. So it kind of follows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In the second tier of enjoyment is accomplishment. Building something, achieving an objective that's somewhat limited in scope, right? So let's say you built a tree house, for your kids or something like that, or you put together a project. Usually there's a sense of task accomplishment associated with that. Even things like completing a degree or achieving a goal would fall into that second category. And none of these are discrete categories. It's sort of a spectrum, but these are kind of conceptual chunks. The third category is what you would call philosophical achievement, or you could even call it transcendent enjoyment. And this is going to vary from person to person, but for me, that includes things like romantic relationships, right, that are meaningful and strong. And you would include sex, again, at this level with a romantic partner, right? Someone that you have an emotional and physical connection with so powerful that it moves you. To me, this also includes things, especially for me personally, like the symphony. So to me, that is an emotional experience. It is so transcendent, the complexity and the emotion conveyed by that music, that it's a level of enjoyment that is barely containable. And that's why it invokes emotion. It'll make you cry, right? And all it is sounds. But the sounds have such meaning in the sense of human history that we develop to the point where someone put together these complex sounds in a way that actually moves our emotional enjoyment. And that to me is significant. And so when we go back to our original point of what it means to be human, the enjoyment of all of the suffering that went into figuring those things out, that then created that enjoyment of something so complex and transcendent that it moved you emotionally, to me, I think helps link the concepts one to the other to realize that we do need to suffer a little bit to really enjoy our existence, but also to advance the human story. So that's a little bit on enjoyment and just how I conceptualize it. I think it's a useful construct. So again, we don't contrast suffering with happiness. We contrast it with comfort. So a meaningful existence includes suffering. When we think about people who have achieved something in their lives, very few of them did that through a life of comfort. Now, they might have had resources. When you think about the scientists in the Renaissance, a lot of them were a nobility or children of nobility. So they had a general life of comfort, but they chose to suffer in a different way, to apply their minds when all they had to do was nothing, right? And they would have been cared for. But they applied their minds to hard problems to try and figure things out. So I would say that it does. Meaningful existence, or an existence that contributes to meaning, includes suffering. But that doesn't mean that more suffering is more better, right? There's a balance to be struck between comfort and suffering, because on one end you have comfort. And if you go back to Aristotle's virtues, the virtues were always a balance or a middle ground, a golden mean between two vices. In terms of comfort, so pure comfort on one end is a vice because you accomplish nothing. But on the other end of that is torture, right? Because it's basically suffering with no meaning. And then there's, on this end, no suffering, but also no meaning. And then the middle ground is where you want to be. And so really what we do is we tolerate the suffering using our front brain to understand the greater impact that we can have, or the greater accomplishments we can achieve by internalizing the value of that suffering. And so again, suffering is not the point. We don't go out with the intent to suffer for no particular reason. It's more about choosing how we suffer, right? Because there's plenty of suffering. There's plenty of suffering in the world that happens automatically, whether it's sickness or bad luck, if you want to call it that, or just things that happen. But not all of those things have meaning. Sometimes they just happen. So, but we can choose oftentimes to use those either experiences or circumstances to gain meaning or to build meaning, right? So a lot of people go through difficult childhoods or difficult family experiences, or they lose a loved one. So depending on what they do with that will determine how much meaning they create. If you use that as a transformative experience to better inform your perspective, and then realize that you want to help other people get through that and make the world a better place, and that is a meaningful suffering. Or if you, even better than that, instead of taking circumstances that simply happen to you, if you choose the way in which you suffer. So let's say that so like those scientists in the Renaissance, you choose to suffer through applying your mind with rigor and logic and science, when you could just, Netflix and chill. That's choosing your suffering to create meaning. Volunteering in the community. A lot of people wouldn't think of that as suffering, but it is a discomfort, right? We could all be sitting at home right now doing nothing, watching TV, especially as easy it is to be entertained today. But we chose to come out and be part of the community. We chose discomfort. We chose suffering because we think it contributes to a greater sense of meaning. And so that's what I mean when I say suffering is not the point, choosing is the point. And that goes back to having a value system that you have either developed or found and researched and understand. Because if you have a value system that is clear to you and is consistent, well, then you can better align your actions to achieve that value system or what is good within that value system. And so if your value system is about creating meaning and advancing the human story, well, then it becomes easier to suffer and to choose your own suffering, because you understand with your front brain that it's for a purpose. So to me, a great example of this is choosing to have kids in today's world, right? A lot of people would say, I don't know why people would have kids in today's world with how bad it is. Well, one, that's kind of how we continue to exist as humans and continue that meaning. But two, and particularly if you've really thought about it, you know that having children is hard. And for those of you who don't have children, having children is very hard. It's very trying. There is a lot of suffering that happens. But those people who do it deliberately as opposed to falling into it, I think realize that they are investing in the future of humanity, and they do it in that way. I am going to suffer and give of myself to invest in the future. So I think that's a really illustrative example of how we suffer already and how that long-term goal will play out, ideally, right? Can't control everything, particularly with kids. And so this is why two of the three main features that we talk about when we talk about being human church is consistency and purpose, right? So our purpose is to advance that human story so that humans can survive and thrive. But we do it through a consistent framework, or as consistent as we think we can make it, right? Starting from the individual, growing to the community, and then growing to include humanity so that we understand the impacts we have. Now, so the third feature we provide is community, which is helpful in dealing with the suffering so that we can share it, so that we can rely on other people when our suffering becomes too great. And so again, so I think it's important to find and not believe in, but understand well your value system, because it becomes so much easier to live when your actions are aligned with your values, right? You reduce that cognitive dissonance that you live. Because we all know that we shouldn't be eating the 5th donut of the day, right? And to keep ourselves from doing that is a little bit of suffering. But when we have a community and consistency in our value system, it becomes a little bit easier, right? We hack our environment to create pressures on ourselves to push down our rear brain and say, no, this is the right thing to do, and here's why. So Matt wrote down a great point related to this. We don't build statues of people who are comfortable their whole life. So I thought it was a really poignant point. We don't build statues of people who are comfortable their whole life. So to summarize kind of what we're after today, comfort precludes growth, or prevents growth. Now again, it's not all about minimizing comfort or maximizing suffering. It's about finding the balance. But if we are too comfortable, we are not growing. And whether it's comfortable in our ideas or comfortable in, using our bodies to get out and do something good or to be fit, comfort precludes growth. And so I would challenge you, what are you doing to grow? What discomfort are you putting yourself in today, or this week, or this month, or this year, that is going to cause you to grow? And as you reflect on that question, ask yourself, do you have a value system that helps you to figure out what you should even be trying to grow toward? Going back to a couple of weeks ago when we talked about goals, do you understand what goals you have or should have and why those goals are important? Because without that, it's difficult. You could pick any goal, but does it actually advance meaning for you? Does it advance your story as part of the human story? And then you ask that question. So I've chosen a goal, I've chosen to suffer. Is that suffering advancing the human story? I think that's a good way to help us keep in mind what we're doing on a regular basis. And so with that, as we always do, I ask that you reflect on, and particularly if you want to share it on Facebook or even to the person that you're grateful for, but share a gratitude, something you're grateful for the week. Tell someone thank you. But share it publicly. I think the more we create a sense of being grateful, again, it helps helps allay that suffering a little bit, helps us realize that there is much good despite the discomfort we experience. And then finally, our last call to action for the day is tell a friend. If you find this conversation valuable and this opportunity to reflect, or the values and the philosophy of this humanist church, share it with someone. They might be going through a time where they're struggling a little bit to help understand how they're advancing their human story. And so we hope you all will join us in the future, that you'll bring a friend, and that we continue to grow and advance the human story. Thank you very much. Have a great week.